Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We are an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. My name is John Bredin. I'm an educator. I teach English. And in my teaching, I like to focus on things like social justice and a better world through language growth. And being able to express ourselves better in words, whether it's on paper as writers, whether it's in speech as talkers and listeners, or the ability to give a lecture, or to give a spontaneous oration as I'm about to give now. I have no idea what I'm going to say, and that's what's interesting and also a little frightening for me, because I don't know what I'm going to say. I still get a little shy at times, when I have to stand up and before others and speak. I used to be a lot more shy when I was younger, and I've been able to overcome that shyness through education. In particular, I always like to go back to my experience as a graduate student at NYU in the middle 1990s, when I was a grad student there studying English education to become an English professor. I have an undergraduate degree from Fordham in English literature, and which I did not come to right away. It took me a while to get to that point. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life when I first graduated high school. I think many young people today and many of my students, my own college students, it's difficult to know what you're going to do with the rest of your life, especially in a society like ours in which the economic situation is so dire that very often people, rather than study something that's meaningful for them, rather than go deep into some subject like philosophy or literature, people feel because of the economy that they have to major in something practical like business, And I think over the past 3 decades, if I'm not mistaken, the business major has become the most popular thing that people are studying in college now. And I was tempted to go that way, but I took a few classes in business, and then I decided that this is not for me, that I want to spend my time as a college student studying subjects that are interesting to me, that give me life, and that are meaningful and interesting, and things like history and literature and philosophy and the arts. One of the classes I took at Fordham as an undergraduate was a course in theater. And I learned a lot about theater. I had a wonderful professor. She was very enthusiastic. She was going to be an actress originally, and she decided that, that there was such a glut of actors out there, and she didn't want to just be part of this, this herd, this cattle car of actresses showing up for the next casting call. And she wound up teaching a class, and as an adjunct professor, and she wound up loving it, and she became an educator rather than an actress. That's interesting. That's the first time I made that connection. Wow. And I think what's interesting is I did it here, just talking off the top of my head, I think what this is, and what language does, is language allows us to think about who we are, to give us a sense of our history, of what we've done and what things in the past, which is never static. It's always sort of in process. When you think about what you've done and part of your life that is meaningful, you can always, in the present, you can update that, you can interrogate that by writing about it, by speaking about it, by making connections. I think I'm very interested in that, in making connections through language, through dialogue, and through writing. I've been writing a lot of memoir-based stuff. Just finished my 5th book. It's called Teaching Under the Radar, Confessions of a Secret Agent of Change. And it's basically my first book on education, and it has to do with the fact that it's difficult to teach well today, especially in institutions that are not interested in what I call democratic pedagogy, democratic teaching. We have a crisis in our education system today. It's growing increasingly authoritarian. It's become focused on things like standardized testing. And so what we're not covering, what we're not doing, is we're not educating people to think critically. We're not educating people to love the humanities, to want to be lifelong readers, and we're not teaching people to appreciate the arts. All the things that make being a human being worthwhile. We're giving that short shrift, and we're moving towards a very technocratic form of education, and I think that has to be resisted. And I think that's actually one of the things I'm doing with this program, is resisting that, creating a space of resistance on the air, a very different kind of television show. This particular dialogue, this monologue, is it a monologue or is it a dialogue? I'd like to pose that question. On the one hand, it's a monologue because I'm one person and I'm speaking to you, okay? You're the audience member. But at the same time, I'm very conscious of your existence as a person in the audience. And I believe that the words that I'm saying right now to you can also spark some meaning in your own consciousness, in your own mind. You could then go talk to other people about that and be in a dialogue with them. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to be dialogical, to spark dialogue between you and other people, between you also and myself. If you choose to, we always, we put the email address on the end of our program, so you could always send me an email or be on the program, or we could always also, if you want to, we could have a conversation off the air. I'm open to do that. What I'm doing right now is using language to make sense out of my life. And not only that, I'm using language to make sense out of the world around me and to articulate some of the problems in that world, which are not being addressed as they should be, I think, And I think the other thing I'm doing is I'm exercising my democratic right as a citizen to speak truth to power and to say what I have to say. And it's going out on the television and or on the computer, on YouTube, and it's a way to to also educate others. And this is really what I'm getting at here, and what is really at the core of my teaching philosophy, which is liberation. I educate to liberate, to help people to find their voices, whether it's on paper, through writing, whether it's in speech. I educate to think critically also, to think critically about what's happening in our society, about the problems. We need to talk more about the problems and think more about the problems and figure out solutions to those problems. And there are lots of problems, as we know. But I do think that if we have hope and we, it's hard to say that word hope now without it sounding like a cliche. I really hate to say that, but I think that our politicians have turned hope into a cliche. right? We all can think about that. We remember that poster with Obama with the word hope. It was sort of a colorful image of Obama. And we see what Obama, that he disappointed so many people by turning away from a lot of what he talked about when he originally ran for president in 2008. He was a lot more progressive. He was much further to the left. And once he became president, he sort of forgot about a lot of those genuine hopes that were behind his candidacy. And he began to run his administration in a more centrist fashion. Even, I would say, probably you could make an argument that he's probably more to the right now, center right, probably further to the right than Richard Nixon even. Since Richard Nixon gave us the EPA. I'm not saying Nixon was the greatest president, but he, it seems that the Republican Party at one time was more liberal than the Democrats are now, and that is a problem, that has to be addressed. And if you're listening to me now and you're a Republican, I want you to think about the fact that Abraham Lincoln was also a Republican, and Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. He fought against the big trusts and the monopolists, and he was part of that original progressive movement that we had in the beginning of the 1900s, when Upton Sinclair wrote that book called The Jungle, which took on the meatpacking industry, and there was that sense that the people were rising up. The women got the right to vote in 1919. Democracy was on the march. The Socialist Party was much more active at that time. There was a man named Norman Thomas who was very well respected. He always wore a suit and tie, and he used to run for president in the 30s and 40s, and he was a national figure. People knew who Norman Thomas was. I don't think anybody knows of any major socialist candidate for president. Certainly not a household word. There is a socialist who was elected city council member in Seattle, and shame on me because I don't remember her name right now. I should know it. We had Jill Stein ran for president as a Green Party candidate in 2012. I voted for Jill Stein, and I probably will vote for another Green Party candidate this time in the congressional elections that are coming up, because I'm very disappointed with the Democratic Party. I don't see them holding the line on the true values of what that party once represented under Franklin Roosevelt, under John F. Kennedy, under Truman. Although Truman wasn't perfect either, but nobody's perfect. Our system is not perfect. I think part of the genius of our political system is that we can change it. That's why we have amendments to the Constitution. And I understand that right now what's happening is there's a movement to amend the Constitution to so that big money would not control the political process anymore. I think that definitely needs to be done. I think anybody who wants to run for president should have that ability, or run for Congress or run for Senate, and you shouldn't have to be a millionaire or a multimillionaire to do that. So these are just some thoughts that I'd like to express to you now, to the public, and I'm trying to give genuine hope for a world that might be, for a better world, for a world that's more kind, that's more caring, that's more loving, that's more peaceful. We just finished the Memorial Day weekend here. This is the day after Memorial Day, and of course we have to honor the soldiers who fought and died for us, and that's I marched in the parade here in Hoboken. I marched with the Hoboken Elks Club. I'm proud to be a Hoboken Elk, past exalted ruler. Do what I can for that lodge that raises money for good causes and charities, and so I have nothing against being patriotic and helping my country and being a good citizen and being a good neighbor. I think all that is good stuff. I think But I think in addition to honoring our veterans, we also need to honor the people who are alive now who might have to go off and fight another war, either in the future or even now. We never know what's going to happen next. I would like to honor those people and do everything I can and start a movement that we could all do everything we can to prevent another war from ever happening. Okay, and I think this is something that you don't really see or hear talked about, which is very strange. One person who did talk about this, I want to say, is a man named Dennis Kucinich, who is a Democratic senator from Ohio. He actually congressman. He was a congressman, and I believe he's retired now, if I'm not mistaken. But Dennis Kucinich was the sponsor of a bill that would have created, that could still create, if we pass this law, a Department of Peace at the cabinet level, right? We already have a Department of War, we have a Department of Defense, but we don't have a Department of Peace. Now, what would a Department of Peace do? Well, it would create some organization and some thinking around the topic of peace. And we could start thinking about, how could we develop a society that was more peaceful? How could we create this education around the issue of peace? How could we raise consciousness? And being an educator, I would definitely have a lot to say about that. That we could definitely be educating for peace. We could have a major in peace studies, for example, which I don't believe exists, so we could have that. We could teach people how to communicate better in their everyday personal lives and also in their communities in ways that are more peaceful and grounded, and so that we can have better dialogues and understand each other when we disagree. I think a big problem in our country now is we have a lot of polarization, and it seems like the two sides, the left and the right, don't even talk to each other anymore. And I think in order to get things done, we need to communicate with each other in more humane methods, more humanely and more kindly, and not demonize the other. If you have a disagreement with somebody, that's one thing. You could have a constructive dialogue, and with some people it's very difficult to have any dialogue with, and if that's the case, then you just move on and you talk to somebody else. But certainly I think a lot of people have lost the ability to communicate effectively, and I think that's the result also of the lack of a humanities education now at the college level, the idea that people are studying practical subjects like business, or they think that it's practical to be a business major or a marketing major. And when you study those subjects, you don't learn philosophy, you don't learn history, you don't learn art, you don't learn all of the subjects that make you a more human person, that to give you the ability to think critically, to engage in more substantive conversations with people, to see the nuances in things, and so we have a lot of people who are thinking in a very black and white way, and also we have people who are focusing on the bottom line being money all the time, instead of because when you train yourself in that marketing mentality, you're losing a lot of humanity. You're losing a sense of complexity, like I said, of nuance, of appreciation for the arts. One of my favorite quotes from John Dewey, who was a great philosopher of education in the 20th century, and this is something that I've said on our show many times before, and I'll probably say it again, is that the aesthetic is the opposite of the anaesthetic. So the arts have the ability to wake people up, to give you a sense of being alive and alert and aware of what's going on around you, to imagine a world that might be, not just the world that we're living in now, but the arts can release imagination. Now, I think one of the great examples of that we have is John Lennon's song Imagine. Imagine all possessions It's easy if you can. No hell below. Oh, I've got the words wrong, but you know what I'm saying. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer. Doo-doo. Well, I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one. John Lennon, thank you for that, and thank you, Yoko, and thank you the Beatles for all that great art and music. And I have a book out, and it's just about ready now. I think just a few corrections that I'm making. I finally got the cover that I like the way it looks. It's a book on education, and it's called Teaching Under the Radar, Confessions of a Secret Agent of Change, and has a dramatic title, right? And because I think teaching is very dramatic. I think, I always wanted to be an actor when I was a young man, and in some ways maybe I still do want to be an actor, and maybe I'm acting right now. Who knows? Maybe this is part of that dream in some way. But I do also think that somewhere I became aware that rather than being a mere actor, for me, it's more important to be a good person and someone who makes a difference in the world. Like a teacher. I think if I had a choice, which is more noble, which is more dignified, which is more something that I would, consider that in my life that would be proud to say that I, was somebody who helped other people grow and gave other people hope and was able to make a difference in people's lives as a great teacher. I think that to me is worth more than saying, oh, I was a star, I was a great actor, and signed autographs, and big deal. There's something shallow, I think, about acting, of what's become of the acting profession. I believe there's always been great actors. There's always been important actors. We've had Laurence Olivier. Today we have certainly Al Pacino and Robert De Niro. We have cinema and theater at its best. There's a humanizing element. It uplifts, and there's a catharsis there. You're able to become more of who you are because of your exposure to the arts. You're able to become more human because of a film like Serpico or Dog Day Afternoon, or a film that's a real genuine work of art rather than just some fluffy movie star vehicle. So I think that for me, the lines can get a little blurry also because, how would I say this? There's a word in education philosophy called agency. To have a sense of agency means this. It means to be able to move through the world like an actor in your own life. To be able to ask questions, to be able to make choices and act on them. That is what it means to have a sense of agency. And I teach for that. I teach for empowering my students and myself with that sense of agency. Okay? It comes when we're fearless in expressing ourselves in language through our writing and through our speech, when we choose what kind of career to pursue, when we choose to be an activist, to fight for a better world that's more just and more caring and more loving, when we engage in projects that are political projects, when we engage in artistic projects, we are exercising a sense of agency. We are growing. We are becoming. And you can always tell a person who has agency because they have that spring in their step, they have that glow in their eye. They're very alert and alive and in the moment. And that's what I like to educate for. And I like to think that I'm an actor in that sense. I'm an actor in the classroom. I'm an actor in the community. It's like being a vibrant human being, and I think that's more important than being a movie star, right? Now, that doesn't mean that those two categories could also be incorporated in some way. You know, one of my favorite actors is Marlon Brando, and Marlon Brando was in a movie in this town in Hoboken called On the Waterfront, and you know, it's hard for me not to remember that incredible performance that he gave whenever I walk along the Hoboken waterfront, or I walk into Elysian Park where he had a conversation with Ava Marie Saint, you know, right by the fence that overlooks the highway, Observer Highway, which at one time there was a Maxwell House coffee factory there. Now it's a condo place for condos. But that performance that Marlon Brando gifted us in that film was also part of an intellectual way of conceiving of what acting might be, as a breakaway from the stiff and formal performances of the past into something that was more human. You notice that, you know, that he mumbled a lot, and he talked like a real person in that film. And if you look at other movies that he was in, like The Wild One, and you know, he was coming out of a program of intellectual integrity in the world of acting that also had a political dimension to it, I believe. There was something known as the Stanislavski method, which originated by a Russian acting intellectual, and that was developed in this country by Lee Strasberg, who then went on to found the Actors Studio. But before that, in the 1940s, there was something at the New School called the Dramatic Workshop, and that was founded by a man named Erwin Piscator, who came from Europe, and he was also the teacher of Bertolt Brecht. And Brecht was the great innovator of theater who brought politics into theater. He didn't stress the aesthetic elements as much as that we are here gathered for an important reason, and we are here to make the world a better place. We are here to use the theater to wake people up to the injustices, to the brutalities, and we're going to go out into the world, you know, transformed in some way. That's what Brecht did. One of the things that Brecht did. And so Piscator and Brecht were together. Then Piscator came to New York. He wound up in Greenwich Village, as all the great, you know, independent thinkers of the past gravitated to Greenwich Village, the intellectuals, the artists, the bohemians. Now you got to be a millionaire to live there, so that's something that's really wrong. I think that people in the real estate world have to realize that, and people in the political world have to realize that, you know, they have to put housing aside for people, for, you know, that the rents are so high now that average people, working people, can't afford to live in the neighborhood of their choice anymore. And in particular, artists and writers and people who don't tend to get paid as much as they should be able to afford to live in a neighborhood. Or if they don't, then what you're going to see is the kind of people who live there are going to be less creative, more conformist types, and you're not going to get the kind of creativity that once defined a place like Greenwich Village. So Erwin Piscator came to Greenwich Village, and he went to the New School, and he founded the Dramatic Workshop. And among his students were Marlon Brando, Tony Curtis, Beatrice Arthur, Judith Malina, who went on to found the Living Theater, and Judith was also a guest on our program here a couple of years ago. You can Google her on YouTube and see that interview between me and Judy Malina. But I think that kind of acting did have a political dimension to it. You know, I remember seeing, actually pretty recently, was Sidney Pollack. There was a program on Turner Classics where Sidney Pollack was being interviewed, and Sidney Pollack was a great actor and director and producer and writer, and he said he remembers very vividly watching a movie with James Dean, and realizing, my goodness gracious, this is like something different has happened. It was like a revolution in the cinema, that before people like James Dean and Marlon Brando, the cinema was filled with people like Cary Grant and Clark Gable, who were just too perfect. You know, they were handsome, and they always wearing a suit, and there was something stiff, and you know, and not that wasn't not an interesting part of American Hollywood, you know, the development of Hollywood as an industry, but eventually it reached a point where, you know, people had to break away from that. They wanted something that was humanizing, that they could feel like you could identify with the character on the screen, you know, and very few people could identify with being like Cary Grant, you know, and speaking perfectly, and, you know, walking around with a cocktail, and, you know. So it was really a great breakthrough. It was liberating when this method acting came out. And one of the great examples that I like to always talk about and mention, especially with Marlon Brando, is that when he won for Best Actor in 1972 for his portrayal of Vito Corleone in The Godfather, which was a tremendous performance, he refused to accept the Academy Award, okay, as a protest against the American government's treatment of the Indians. He decided to allow an Indian squaw to go up on the stage and accept the award for him, and she gave a little speech in which she talked about, you know, Marlon and how he felt about the injustices that have been done to the Indians, and then the audience started to boo, you know, a lot of conformist type Hollywood types were booing, you know. So even in Hollywood, you know, you have the good, you have the bad, you have the conformist, you have the new, you have the radical, you have the innovative. And another person who I admire a lot is Warren Beatty, because he was a genuine political person. He was a man of integrity, as far as I'm concerned. He was one of the few actors who had a real moral compass, and you can see that reflected in the work. You know, you could see that, first of all, well, Bonnie and Clyde. You know, Bonnie and Clyde was a radical movie. There was a lot of antipathy to the banks at that time. You know, this was the Great Depression, so there was a radical nature of that film feeding into the public's antipathy of the banking industry at that time. So the portrayal of Bonnie and Clyde as heroes, as cult heroes, which they were at the time in the Depression. They were considered heroic in some way, you know. And goodness knows, you know, the banks certainly robbed from us. You know, we saw that with the Great Recession, where banks were given bailouts and the people got sold out, the banks got bailed out, right? So, you know, Warren Beatty was always about making these radical choices. He made a film called Reds, which was a celebration of the life of John Reed, who was a journalist from Greenwich Village, who went over to Russia to cover the Russian Revolution, and he wrote some wonderful things about that. And they started these John Reed clubs all over the country, you know, these organizations that were radical, that were socialist. And I think it was the only time in American history where a major studio put out a movie that was about communism, that was about socialism, but that was a positive spin on that, you know. Now, that's not to say that what happened with Stalin was terrible and awful. You always have to say that. But in the beginning, when the Russian Revolution first happened, you know, it was actually a big improvement over the czars. You know, the czars were oligarchic, plutocratic, they were dictatorial, and so to have a genuine people's revolution rising up, that was a very positive moment in our human history. It has to be realized as such. What happened after the revolution was a tragedy, and unfortunately a lot of people in our country now, those who have not been educated properly, are easily led to believe that socialism is bad, that it's somehow associated with Soviet Russia, which is not the case. If Karl Marx had come back to life and saw what was going on in Russia, he would say, that's not what I had in mind. He was, Marx was all about egalitarianism, equal distribution of the wealth, sharing. There was a democratic aspect of Marx that was not reflected in the Soviet Union, So as far as getting back to acting, yes, I think all of us need to become better actors in the world. And the stage that we act on is the stage of life, is the stage also of politics, of community, of going to our local council meetings or Board of Education meetings, or starting a political organization, teaching in schools and outside of school, getting people together for dialogue and discourse, writing and publishing our books and speaking out to the world, what we have to say, and not being afraid to hold back on that. And if people disagree with us, that's okay. We have to learn how to have constructive conversations and agree to disagree, and that's okay too. So Warren Beatty, to bring it back to my narrative, Warren Beatty was in a play with my dad, and because my dad was an actor when he was a young man, and he could have become an actor because he was pretty good at it. He was in a play called The Caine Mutiny Court-Martial. He played Junius Urban III, and he brought comic relief to that play, a very important play. When it was on Broadway, Henry Fonda was starring in it. And Claudia and I this weekend, we watched the first half of Mr. Roberts, which is a wonderful Navy film, and has a great performance by Jimmy Cagney towards the end of his career, Jack Lemmon just starting out, and Henry Fonda, who was 51 years old. I mean, he was 50 years old in that movie. They thought he was too old. They didn't want to cast him in that role. Originally, the producers wanted Marlon Brando actually to play Mr. Roberts, but John Ford was the director, who had worked with Henry Fonda before, said, I want Fonda or I'm not going to do it. And Fonda had been away from the movies for 8 years. He stepped away from movie making for 8 years to go back to Broadway, to be on stage, right? Because that's where being a real actor, you get on stage, and that's where you get your chops, and that's where you really prove yourself as an actor, in front of a live audience. And a lot of people don't realize that about Henry Fonda, that he had that kind of integrity. And one of the plays he was in on Broadway was called The Caine Mutiny Court-Martial. That's the same play my dad was in off-Broadway in Cliffside Park at the North Jersey Playhouse. Robert Ludlum was the producer, who later went on to write spy novels and became very successful at that. Matt Damon is now starring in the movies that they're making out of Robert Ludlum's books. And my dad's director in that play was a man named Chester Morris, who some of you may know him from the Boston Blackie series. He played a detective in the sort of a B-movie series from the 40s and 50s. But before that, in the 30s, Chester Morris was a star, a major star of Hollywood. He was with Wallace Beery, called The Big House, which is a film that actually saved Beery's career, because Beery was not making the transition from silent to talkies, and until he was in that movie with Chester Morris, and then he went on from there to become one of the top stars of the 30s. Certainly, he was the highest-paying star at one time, Wallace Beery, in the 1930s. It was in his contract that he would get $1 more than any other actor. But Chester Morris was also in movies with Clara Bow, the It Girl, and Norma Shearer. He was in a movie with Lucille Ball called Five Came Back. It was a movie, it was actually considered the first disaster movie. It was about a plane that went down in South America, and 5 people got stranded, including Chester Morris and Lucille Ball. And the cannibals in the jungle were approaching them. And so, anyway, I won't tell you what happened in case you want to watch Five Came Back. But he was in all these important movies, and near the end of his career, he went back to the stage, and he was in this directing a play in Cliffside Park, The Caine Mutiny Court-Martial. My dad was an actor, showed promise, And Morris said to him, you know, kid, you got talent. I want you to come on the road with this play. So my father had an existential choice to make. And what he chose was, in his mind, was the ethical choice, which was to stay home, to be a good father, to be a good husband, and he felt that would be a conflict by being on the road, that he'd be to spend time away from his family. And so I have to honor my father for making that choice. And because, as Cornel West said in his lecture that he gave at Bethany Baptist Church in Newark a month ago, the great intellectual Cornel West, he says, I am who I am because somebody loved me. I am who I am because somebody loved me, and I am who I am because my mother and father loved me. Gene and Jack Bredin loved me, so that's why I'm here now, talking to you, saying these things. And so my dad, who gave up the dream of acting, eventually, in his 30s, became an activist. And there's that word, act. It's still in it. Activism. He started going to council meetings in the town, fighting against the big developers who were coming in with their big projects, their 20-story buildings that were going to be casting shadows over our community of Edgewater, our small town. Right? They were going to tear up the woods behind our house, which was the southern extension of the Palisades, the beautiful Palisade cliffs that go all the way up to Alpine and that come all the way down to Jersey City, where they finish right here, right in Hoboken in Jersey City. But right behind our house in Edgewater, we had this thick, lush woods and shrubs and trees. It was beautiful. We breathed fresh air, oxygen from the trees. And these gangster developers, we call them, because they were bribing the politicians. They were in cahoots with the mob. They were going to put buildings behind our house. My dad caught wind of it. He said, no, you're not. He went down to the council meetings, and he opened his mouth, and he spoke with a group of people. But because of his background as an actor, having been in a play directed by Chester Morris, having been in a play with Warren Beatty, right? My dad somehow had a little extra panache or confidence, whatever you want to call it, and when he spoke out, it really resonated, and there was an honesty to it, and he became famous in the town of Edgewater in the 1970s and 80s. If you talk to anybody who lived in Edgewater in that time, mention Jack Bredin, and they will say good things about Jack because he stopped the destruction of the Palisade Cliffs. And they made him a commissioner, by the way. They made him a commissioner of the Park of the Palisades, probably just to calm him down, because they wanted to make him happy, because then they set their sights on other parts of town, like the waterfront. And with that, his track record was mixed. He had some victories, but there were some defeats as well. And it's difficult to fight big money, as they say. But he scored enough victories to be successful as an activist. See? And that was all part of my education, seeing my father, getting involved, getting active, educating himself about all the zoning laws. And he would read these law books. A man who never went to college became an intellectual. Well, he was always an intellectual, my dad, always very philosophical, and still is, So we all come from somewhere, but then we must go on and we must make our own way in the world. And I hope to continue being a liberator in classrooms and on the air and off the air, and helping others grow and opening up these dialogic spaces where I could find my voice and help others to find their voice. So you're welcome to come on our show, and you're welcome to be part of a group dialogue. Probably the next time we're going to gather as a community in Hoboken will be in October at the Symposia Bookstore again. But we're open to meet in people's homes. We're open to meet one-on-one, and we do want to feature this kind of substantive dialogue and conversation about arts, about culture, about education. We want to try to get our country back. We have a lot of problems that need to be addressed that are not being addressed, and we hope that you'll be a part of that with us. One of the things I like to always talk about is I think we need a shorter work week because people are overworked, and believe it or not, back in the 1960s, they were actually talking about one day that there would be a 15-hour work week. In fact, they predicted it would be by the year 2000. In 1965, a Senate subcommittee, United States Senate subcommittee, predicted that by the year 2000, we would have a 15-hour work week. Not a 40-hour, not a 50-hour, not a 60-hour like it is now, but a 15-hour work week. And so if we only make what we need, if we reorganize the economy, if we take out a lot of the unnecessary jobs, if we eliminate certain fields like finance capital has to be trimmed down a lot. We know that. There's a lot of unnecessary speculation that's going on that we need to, just look at the advertising industry. Do we really need the advertising industry? Is it necessary to convince people to buy products that they might not need? There's a lot of room that we can redirect our resources and our energy and begin to spread the money around more equitably. Speaking of that, I like to remind people that back in the 1950s, when Eisenhower was president, we had a Republican president, and we had a 91% top tax rate. That means, the wealthiest people in the country paid high taxes, and they paid it, for the most part, very willingly, because we had a much happier society back then. There were reasons for unhappiness in the 50s that came from other sources, which were an oppressive social order, which gradually got relaxed in the 1960s. We had a lot of breakthroughs in that way, but economically, people were much more taken care of. The society was much more humane in terms of economics, really from the 1930s through the 1970s. During the time when the New Deal, which was established by Franklin Roosevelt, was basically held sway through that whole period, and also was bolstered by Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, which he put in place in 1964. But by the 1970s, there was this reaction against any kind of help for poor people. There was an anti-poor people sentiment that was being fomented on the right wing. Ronald Reagan used to talk about a total myth that he made up, which was that that these black women were picking up their welfare checks driving Cadillacs, which was that's not something you see every day, or that was a lie. There was a lot of lies that were promulgated to turn the society against the poor, and to convince people that by letting rich people have more money, that was going to trickle down and everybody would be happier, and because the money would flow throughout the society. Well, that has proven to be very wrong. It's been proven to be wrong because when rich people have tons of money, they tend to hold on to it, and they tend to invest it, and they tend to, it doesn't trickle down. So trickle down economics was itself something that was chimerical. It was a fiction that was made up. So we have to be very careful in seeing through a lot of the distortions, a lot of the propaganda that's coming at us through politics, through the mainstream media, and we need to begin to create a different kind of politics that's honest, that's authentic, that's truly democratic. We had tough times in the past, and I think we're going to get through this. I have faith, I have hope. Certainly Abraham Lincoln, had a lot of faith. And he used to talk about the better angels of our humanity, that they would come through. But we had divisiveness in the past. We hopefully will learn how to get beyond that divisiveness. We'll learn how to communicate better. And hopefully venues like this will be helpful. And what else can I say? It's about growing. It's about learning and growing and reading and writing and speaking, and it's also about the arts. I think the arts are very, very important. And Claudia and I saw a play this past weekend at the Cherry Lane Theater, which is an it's an off-Broadway theater in Greenwich Village. The play was called A FABLE, and there was a lot of politics in this play because the writer, David Van Asselt, was influenced by Bertolt Brecht, who was a great playwright whose concept of theater was very political. We were treated to a rare work of theater that was not fluffy. It was not designed just to entertain, although it was entertaining, but it left us with a wonderful critique of the corporatization of our society, of what's going on. I think one of the things that stands out in that play was they said there's a special section of hell that's reserved for stockbrokers and real estate agents, and so that was a shock to me because I've recently become a real estate agent, so I don't want to wind up in that part of hell. So, one of the things I did, I've mentioned this on our show before, was I wrote a book called The Ethical Sales Agent, a transformative sales pedagogy to liberate corporate culture and save America. So I'm fighting for liberation even in the corporate world, okay? To also help me in that struggle, I wrote a book called Spy in the House of Capitalism to create an identity for myself in the corporate world as somebody who's in there for a purpose, which is to raise money for the cause, and to try my best to humanize while I'm in that space as well, because there are people who are hurting in corporate America. There are people sitting at cubicles now. There are people on what I call the corporate plantation who need to come out of hiding, who need to criticize the system that they're feeding off of, who need to be brave, who need to come forth and tell the truth about what goes on in those back rooms and the conversations that take place and the kind of evil that's being promulgated by corporate America. Let's be really spiritual now and say the truth. This corporate system has become evil because people are dying. People are dying in the world. Corporatism is behind most of our wars are caused by corporations. This has been proven, okay? Historians have documented this. Most of the wars, probably World War II might have been the only war that was, where we were provoked. But at the same time, World War II had its roots in World War I. And that war was all about colonies. That war was all about all these European countries were trying to see how much of Africa they could carve up, and the Germans were jealous because the British had too much a piece of the pie, and they wanted to get into the colonial game, and that was really what was behind the First World War, And then, of course, Germany was punished with all these reparations, and then that caused all the seeds of misery that eventually led to World War II. Although Hitler could have been stopped before, and I think that's a lesson in the future, when we see the growing dark clouds of fascism starting to gather in whatever society, whether it's our society or wherever, we have to put a stop to it immediately before it gets out of hand. So, that's a warning, to future generations. Do not forget your history, because you might repeat that history if you forget it. But even going back to the First World War, the United States originally had no intention of getting involved in that war. In fact, Woodrow Wilson was elected on a neutrality platform in 1912. He said, I'm going to keep you out of war. And in 1916 as well. What got us into that war were companies like the DuPonts, who stood to make a lot of money, and there was a propaganda campaign against, the Germans, and calling them Huns, and that they throw babies up in the air and catch them on their bayonets. All this propaganda that came out of the yellow journalism of the time, the Hearst papers, the sinking of the Lusitania was a false flag also. It's been proven that was not attacked, that there was or if it was attacked, there was a legitimate reason for it, because they were violating the terms of that space, the nautical space. The sinking of the Maine, which got us into the Spanish-American War, that was a false flag attack. You know, that was an explosion on the Main. It wasn't an attack by the Spanish. It was played up that way to give the United States an excuse to go into war. We have to be very careful now when our leaders have some trumped up thing and say we got to go to war. We have to say, wait a minute, there's a history in this country of false flag attacks. The Vietnam War, okay, the Gulf of Tonkin. Okay, it turns out it was not as simple as they said it was, but, you know, they were itching for a way to get into that war. So, you know, going forward, we want a world that's based on love and peace and caring. All human beings need love. We would not be here if it wasn't for love. The Beatles were right when they said all you need is love, and Tolstoy was right when he said that universal love is the fundamental law of life. All right? None of us would be here today. I would not be sitting on this couch if my parents didn't love me, if people did not love me unconditionally. And I also had the love of grandparents and uncles and aunts and extended family. All of us, we grow up in a community that embraces us. And if we don't get that love and nurturance, then something goes wrong. Then we see the kind of mental illness, and we see the kind of devastation in our society, the depression that's on the rise, and young people who don't have a sense of purpose. They don't have a sense of meaning. They don't know who they are because they haven't been educated to think for themselves. They haven't been told the truth about what's going on in our world. So they believe a lot of the lies in the media. Okay? So we need spaces for the truth. Thank goodness for Michael Moore and his wonderful documentaries. Capitalism, a Love Story, I think, is one that should be seen by more people. Although quite a few people did see it. But the next step, of course, is to put all this energy into some kind of political formation that we can begin to vote for candidates who have our interests in mind, not the corporation's interest. And if we make an amendment to the Constitution that limits the influence of big money in politics, that would go a long way to getting our freedom and our democracy back. Okay, so thank you for watching the Public Voice Salon. My name is John Bredin. On behalf of my wife Claudia, who's working now, and I'm home with the tripod and the camera, my darling wife and I, without her help, I could not do this show, so I always have to acknowledge the great love of my life. So thank you all for watching us, and until next time, have a good night.